Welcome to Sola Church Online.
I'm Alan Rigg. This is my wife, Miranda Landers, and together we lead Sola Church, a life-giving church in Santa Monica, California.
We meet in person on Sundays at 10 a.m. at Joslyn Park, which is located at 633 Kensington Road.
And we pre-record parts of our service to share with you here online.
And we've got a great service for you this morning, so let's worship.
Blessed be your name in the land that is plentiful, where your streams of abundance flow. Blessed be your name. Blessed be your name when I'm found in the desert place. Though I walk through the wilderness, blessed be your name. Every blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Blessed be your name when the sun's shining down on me, when the world's all as it should be. Blessed be your name. Blessed be your name on the road marked with suffering, though there's pain in the offering. Blessed be your name. Every blessing you pour out, I turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. Every blessing you pour out, I turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Give and take away. Give and take away. Heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. All I did was bow down. All I did was stay still. Hallelujah, you have saved me. So much better your way. Hallelujah, great defender. So much better your way. You know before I knew where my heart can see to find your truth. Your mercy is the shade I'm living in, and you restore my faith and hope again. And all I did was praise. Oh, and all I did was worship. All I did was bow down. Oh, and all I did was stay still, stay still. Hallelujah, you have saved me. So much better your way. Hallelujah, great defender. So much better your way. When I thought I lost me, you knew where I left me. You reintroduced me to your love. Picked up all my pieces, put me back together. You are the defender of my heart. When I thought I lost me, you knew where I left me. You reintroduced me to your love. You picked up all my pieces, put me back together. You are the all I need to do is worship. Lord, I will just bow down. No, I'm just gonna stay still.
This is that time in our service when we worship with our giving. If you're just checking us out today, please don't feel obligated to give. But if Sola Church is your church home, or you just want to help us accomplish our mission to be a life-giving church here on the West Side and beyond, it's super easy to make a one-time tax-deductible donation or even to schedule a recurring gift.
The easiest way is to look for the link in your chat feed. But you can also go to solachurch.life and look for the tab at the top that says Give.
Last week, we asked you guys to pray that Santa Monica would reopen its indoor spaces in the parks. We're meeting outdoors at Joslyn Park and want to move inside to the auditorium. So you guys prayed and God answered. We were notified yesterday. We're taping on Friday. We were notified yesterday on Thursday that the city is going to begin taking applications in September. So we're just weeks away, hopefully, from being able to move inside. It's going to provide beautiful worship space, but also room to relaunch our children's ministry, Sola Kids. So we're super excited. Keep those prayers coming. God's doing great things.
Let's get into our time of teaching.
So you're dating someone and things are going great, or at least you thought they were, until they told you that it's over, or worse, they ghosted you. You know, maybe you worked so hard to get out of debt, and then the minute that you did, you found out that the car was going to need a new transmission. Maybe you've worked hard to lose weight, to get into shape, to just be healthier and have more energy, and then on a routine doctor's visit, you find out that you're facing a medical emergency, a health crisis of some kind. It could be that you're in sales and you had like the best month that you ever had, like you've never had commissions like that ever before. But then the very next month, the bottom falls out. It's just crickets, no sales at all. Maybe you've attended a worship gathering, even one online like this one, and you just felt so much better after than you did before. But then the next thing you know, you get bad news, and you just feel yourself slipping right back into that dark place. What is it with the peaks and the valleys? They say that life is a roller coaster, and they are not wrong. Life is a roller coaster with all the ups and all the downs, with all the excitement and all the fear. Why is it that in life, the highest highs are often followed by the lowest lows? Is there an alternative to simply, white knuckling it through life? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today in a message titled Dynamic Range. Let's open the Bible to Mark chapter 9. We're in the middle of a message series called Convergence. Convergence is what we call it when two or more things come together. And on the pages of Mark's gospel, we see eternity come together with time. We see heaven come together with earth. We see God come together with man. And so we call this series Convergence. And it happens not just on these pages, but in this place, even this online space. So next week, we're going to talk about how to love hard to love people. Anybody have a hard to love person in their life? And the week after that, we're going to talk about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. When was the last time you heard a message about that from someone who's actually been married, divorced, and remarried? So looking forward to that. But again, this morning in this online service, Dynamic Range. The first point that I want to make, the first observation, is that it's all about highs and lows. Look with me at Mark 9, beginning in verse 14. It says, "And when he, Jesus, came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them, and scribes disputing with them. Immediately when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed, and running to him, greeted him. And he asked the scribes, "What are you discussing with them?" Then one of the crowd answered and said, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who has a mute spirit, and wherever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not." Now I just want to take you back to what we talked about last week. The day before this, Jesus had taken Peter, James, and John, the so-called inner circle, up onto the mountaintop to pray. Instead, they'd gone to sleep. But when they woke up, they discovered an event that we called the Transfiguration. Jesus was being transformed. If life is like tent camping and death like breaking camp, essentially what Jesus did was to unzip the door to his tent from the inside and open it and allow the disciples to see the divinity behind the humanity. Jesus, both God and man. They also observed that Jesus was speaking with Moses and Elijah, two Old Testament heroes. They were both there. In addition to that, they heard God the Father speak from a cloud. I mean, it was amazing. It was a mountaintop experience, but that was the day before. The day after that, the day that we're reading about, they come down the mountain into the valley to find a debate and a demon. Man, that got real dark, real fast. If I'm Peter, I'm like looking at James and John, "You guys thinking what I'm thinking?" And they're like, "Yeah, it's time to bounce. Like, let's go back to the mountaintop." Like, why in the world would we trade the mountaintop for the valley? How many of us would rewind if we could? Like if you could go back to another time in your life. I think most of us think about a time or a place, a season that was just so amazing, where things were so good and we'd go back if we could. What is it with the peaks and the valleys? Well, believe it or not, our lives need balance. I know that's not the kind of thing that's necessarily going to make us feel better, but it's true. Our lives need balance. We see this in nature itself, where day is balanced by night, where summer is balanced by winter. In the same way, our lives are balanced with different experiences. We have the best of times, balanced by the worst of times. We have a day to remember, balanced by a day to forget. We have a dream come true, balanced by a bad dream or even a nightmare. I think about so-called dynamic range, which I've borrowed as the title for this message. You know, dynamic range, like when it has to do with sound, the dynamic range is the difference between the loudest and the softest sounds. You ever wonder why TV commercials are so much louder than the programs? Well, you know, I mean, you could be watching a show and all of a sudden it cuts to commercials and it just seems like the volume doubles or triples. They say that in reality, the commercials are no louder than the show. It's just that when you're watching TV, there's a dynamic range. And when you're watching the show, sometimes, you know, you're at the bottom of that range, and other times you're in the middle of that range, and other times you're at the top of that range. But when the commercial comes on, it's like all at the top of the range. And that's what makes it seem so much louder. But most of us don't like it. You know, most of us reach for the remote and turn it down during the commercials. I had a remote one time that had a button that you could press that like just automatically cut the volume in half. It was the perfect thing to press during commercials. Well, so in that sense, we recognize that a wide range is good, like during the show. A narrow range is bad, like during the commercials. But think about the Transfiguration itself. Think about the people that we see there, about Elijah and Moses and Jesus. You know, think about Elijah to begin with. In 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah has this mountaintop experience, literally on Mount Carmel. In the very next chapter, Queen Jezebel threatens him. He runs for his life and deals with depression. Think about Moses. He had a mountaintop experience at the Red Sea. Remember when the Jews were fleeing Egypt and they came to the Red Sea? Moses stepped into the water and held up, his rod and the water parted. In the very next chapter, They come to a place called Mara where they don't have any water, and the people begin to complain and to turn against Moses. Even Jesus himself, back in chapter 1, we read about Jesus' baptism, and then, not in the next chapter, but in the next verse, we read about Jesus being led into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. So, this is why it has been said that we need to be as watchful after the victory as before the battle. I'm not talking about being pessimistic. We all know those people who cannot enjoy anything because the minute something good happens to them, they immediately start thinking about the bad thing that's going to come next. Like, this can't possibly last. This is too good to be true. Something bad is going to happen. I'm not talking about being pessimistic. As followers of Jesus, as people of faith, we should be the most optimistic people in the world. But what I am talking about is just understanding the ebb and flow of life. Like it says in Ecclesiastes 3 verse 1, to everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. So what season or what time are you in right now? Instead of wishing that we were in another season, what we want to do is we want to find out what the season that we're in has to offer us. So dynamic range, it's all about highs and lows. Here's a second observation. The lows are all about the highs. So look with me at verse 19. It says that Jesus answered him and said, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me. Now, when Jesus uses that word faithless, he's probably talking about the unbelieving disciples. It's an interesting thing because, this thing that they're trying to do, they're trying to deliver this boy. Well, they'd been empowered to do it in chapter 6, verse 7, and they'd done it before in chapter 6, verse 13. For some reason, they couldn't do it now. Why not? Well, here's where I want to jump ahead in our text, and we'll come back and get the verses in between, but I want you to jump ahead to verse 28. When Jesus is sort of debriefing with his disciples after this whole episode is over. And so in verse 28, when Jesus had come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, why could we not cast it out? So he said to them, this kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting. So notice that phrase in verse 29, prayer and fasting. An old school name for this, means of grace. A new school name for this, spiritual disciplines. Last week at the end of our online service, I spoke briefly about the discipline of Bible reading and the discipline of prayer. Jesus adds fasting here. But we want to talk a little bit about, why that's so important. My eldest daughter, Lauren, ran in the Boston Marathon earlier this year. You may have heard me talk about that. And the Boston Marathon, like any other marathon, it's 26.2 miles. She ran that in 3 hours and 32 minutes. Unbelievable. Me, I can't remember the last time I ran a mile. unless you're counting like cumulative trips from the sofa to the refrigerator, then maybe I would hit it over time. But if Lauren said to me, Dad, I want you to run a marathon with me, well, first I would laugh out loud. And then after I recovered, man, I would have to start training. Because you know what? The last time I tried to run a mile a couple years ago, I remember going into the track and, a mile 4 times around the track. I got around the track like half of one lap. I ran about half of one lap, and then I had to walk a half, run a half, walk a half. I couldn't do it. I couldn't run a whole mile. And so I know that, if I just, without training, if I just showed up at the site of the marathon and began to run, and my strategy was simply to try harder, that strategy is not going to work. There's no degree of trying harder that's going to enable me to run a marathon. It's not about trying, it's about training. That's why in the weeks and months leading up to the Boston Marathon, Lauren spent so much time training. A lot of that on the treadmill, lots and lots of time on the treadmill in her garage. So many of us, maybe you, are part of the try harder school of life. Like if that's you, if, anytime you come up against an area in your life that needs change or needs growth or needs improvement, if your strategy is simply to try harder, how's that working? In my experience, that seldom ever works. And when it does work, it never lasts. How come? Well, because it's not about trying, it's about training. And the spiritual disciplines are training. Speaking for myself, if I'm running the treadmill just to run the treadmill, I'm going to quit running the treadmill. And if I'm having devotions just to have devotions, that's a word we use for spending time with God, reading the Bible and praying and so forth. If I'm having devotions just to have devotions, I'm going to quit having devotions. When Lauren was on the treadmill, she was thinking about the Boston Marathon. She was thinking about that race, about her goals for that race, and about how good it was going to feel to complete that race. And when we're having devotions, we need to be thinking about the race of life and thinking about how we want to run to win. So again, that phrase, prayer and fasting, I mentioned earlier that when Jesus took Peter, James, and John to the mountaintop, he took them there to pray. Mark doesn't tell us that, but Luke does. So this is what they needed. They were taken to pray, but instead they went to sleep. And now they're in the valley where they can't do something that would have required prayer. That might have, been different had there been prayer happening. So it's in the valley that we come to fully appreciate the peak. After a peak, when we're in the valley, that's when we're glad that we made the most of our time on the peak, or when we're mad or sad that we didn't. You can think of it this way: in the peak, we see who God is, and in the valley, we see whom God is making us. On the peak, we see what God can do. In the valley, we see what God can do through us. If the peak is the lesson, the valley is the pop quiz. I'm thinking about the first home that I ever owned. It was in Austin, Texas. And this is when Lauren was, just a child. And so I had a place in the garage where I would have her stand with her back against the wall. I would take a ruler and try to put it, level over her head, make a mark, and then measure her height, make a note of the height and the date. And I did this over time. So, you could see how she was growing and how she was getting taller. Eventually, I had a house built in Round Rock. And so as I prepared to move from Austin to Round Rock, from the old house to the new, I had this idea that I was going to, use the right kind of saw to cut the drywall out of the garage wall so I could take that with me. And I was gonna fix that. I was gonna take another piece of drywall, try to patch that, tape float, do all that kind of a thing. And then someone said to me, well, why don't you just jot down the measurements and recreate it? I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm such a knucklehead. Like, I can't believe I was going to create all that work for myself. So I made notes, and then at the new house in the garage, I recreated that and then continued, measuring it. But here's the thing. If you want to see how much you've grown, you've got to have your back against the wall. When it's all good, man, it's easy. But when it goes from good to bad and bad to worse, that's when you find out how you're doing in life. That's when you find out whether you're growing. That's when you find out whether you're, more mature, more strong, is when the bad things happen. That gives you a chance to measure that. Never doubt in the valley what God has taught you on the peak. So dynamic range. It's all about highs and lows. And the lows are all about the highs. But then a third and final observation, the highs are all about the lows. Look at verse 20. Going back to where, we kind of jumped ahead. Then they brought him to him. They brought the boy to Jesus. And when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him. And he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. So he asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood. And often he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. So this boy was deaf, that is, unable to hear. He was dumb or mute, unable to speak. And he was demon-possessed, meaning, as we've talked about on other occasions, that an evil spirit, that is, a fallen angel, had taken control of his will. Something I've said repeatedly that, most of us have little or no experience with. But this is a sad story and a desperate dad. Matthew adds that the dad was kneeling. And Luke tells us that this boy was his only child. This dad likely thought a lot about the trade that his son might never learn, thought a lot about the wife that his son might never get to love, thought a lot about the children that his son might never get to look at. And he did the right thing. He brought his son to Jesus in verse 17. So speaking to the parents and the grandparents out there, how are you bringing your children or your grandchildren to Jesus? Are we, I'm a father and a grandfather, are we praying for them? Are we ever like this father praying desperate prayers? We can pray for our kids that God would bless them, that God would watch over them and protect them, that God would keep them safe, that God would keep them healthy. We can pray that, God would, bring wonderful friends into their lives. We can pray that obviously at different ages, there's different stages and different things that we're going to pray. But, we can pray when they're children that, God would help them to choose the right career path or the right college, or, help them to, make good choices about who they date or who they marry, or, just all those kinds of things. We can make all of those things matters of prayer. And especially that they would be people of faith, that they would trust Jesus to forgive them and to lead them. But also, not only would we ask, are we praying for them, but are we teaching them? I love it in Deuteronomy 6, verses 6 and 7, when it says, "And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up." This is like one of my favorite verses along these lines, because the emphasis isn't so much on something that's structured, though there's a place for that, but it's just all about, spiritual conversations being a part of your life. And it's about seizing those moments and those opportunities as you just go about the daily stuff to talk about spiritual things. But it's not even just about telling them, it's about showing them. Howard Hendricks said, "If teaching were only telling, my children would be incredibly brilliant. I've told them everything they need to know." Chances are we've done the same thing, right, with our kids and with our grandkids. But, it's so important that we show them, that we model these things for them. So again, parent, grandparent, would you be satisfied if your children or your grandchildren grew up to be just like you? Like if they grew up to be just like you, would that be what you aspire for them? And perhaps to any future parents, future grandparents out there, are you becoming the kind of person that the kids you hope to have would admire, would want to follow, would want to emulate? Well, verse 23, Jesus said to him, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." And immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, "Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief." Compare, when the dad said, "If you can do anything," and what Jesus said, "If you can believe." Jesus is like, "Of course I can. Can you? Of course I can do anything. Can you believe?" And compare also the word anything in verse 22 and the word all things in verse 23. He's just asking if Jesus can do anything. Jesus is basically saying all things are possible. So how do we understand that? We wonder whether all things means all things and whether we have enough faith. Well, all things means all things within the will of God. And enough faith? Well, how much faith is enough? In that debriefing, we jumped ahead already and kind of talked about that debriefing that Jesus did with his disciples right after this. But in Matthew's account, Matthew says that Jesus added this: "If you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. And nothing will be impossible for you." So, faith as a mustard seed is a very small seed. So the issue is not that we need more faith. Jesus' point is not that we need more faith. His point is that it takes very little faith. I mean, how encouraging is that? He's telling me, he's telling you, hey, it takes a minimal amount of faith, like any faith at all. We tend to think that faith is a feeling. We imagine that when we're praying for something, we need to feel a certain way. We need to feel confident, not just that it can happen, but that it's going to. But faith is not a feeling at all. Faith is believing God for everything that he promises, which is why it has nothing to do with how much faith we have, but whom our faith is placed in. You can have all the faith in the world in something that's not reliable, and it's not going to it's not going to pan out. You could have very little faith in something that's totally reliable, and it's going to pan out despite your little bit of faith. So the same thing is true with the object of our faith is God. You notice also in verse 24, the word believe and the word unbelief. Man, I mean, this dad, what he said, I believe, but help my unbelief. I love that because he was keeping it real. He was being honest about how we all are conflicted and we're all sort of torn between those two things. But notice that he said what he did with tears. I love the words of Ken Geyer. He writes, there are moments too sacred for words. There are holy places within the sanctuary of our conversations where only tears are pure enough to enter. He calls it the sacrament of tears. So good. You know, the book of Psalms has been referred to as a pool of tears. In Psalm 56, verse 8, David talks about God putting our tears in a bottle. There are many ancient traditions along these lines. In some cultures, mourners have captured their tears in a bottle that they've then buried with, you know, their loved one who's passed. But, you know, in Old Testament times, there was also a tradition where if someone was going to go off to war, a family member, like a mother or a wife, would have a bottle. And anytime that she cried, missing, you know, the son, the husband, anytime that she worried about his safety, about his well-being, about whether or not he was going to ever return home, you know, they would capture the tears in that bottle. And so then when that person would come home from war, you know, they would be presented with that bottle and they would see, you know, that the bottle was filled with liquid. How much they were loved, how much they were missed, how much that person longed for them to return safely. What a cool thought that when we get to heaven, you know, even if it's just a figurative kind of a thing, just this idea that when we get to heaven, we're going to know how much God cared about us throughout our life, how nothing escaped his attention. In the book of Revelation, when it talks about, you know, our eternal future, in Revelation 21 verse 4, it says that God will wipe away every tear from our eyes. That is every tear shed on earth, like our lifetime full of tears. God is going to wipe those away from our eyes. That's so intimate. It's so intimate. You know, sometimes you're having a conversation with someone and one of you tears up and the other person might feel so uncomfortable that they look away. You know, they try to like not even acknowledge that they saw it or that they recognized it. Then other times, you know, we might tear up and the person might acknowledge it in some way. And that's just a little more intimate. But if we tear up and that person reaches out and touches our face to physically wipe the tears from our eyes, that is so intimate. And that's the intimacy that we're going to have with God. In fact, it goes on in Revelation to say that there shall be no more crying, among other things. So God will wipe away the tears of our lifetime, and then there will be no more tears. So what I'm getting at, though, is just that it's in the valley that we experience an intimacy with God that we don't always experience on the peak. When we think about the stories, the Mount of Transfiguration, and now what happens in this valley, on the peak, God is almost scary. You know, it actually tells us that they were afraid. But in the valley, God is so tender. So it's in the valleys that we come to know God in ways that we can't come to know him on the peaks. Verse 25, when Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to the deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more. Then the spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him. And he became as one dead, so that many said, he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. So listen, it's in the valley that we come to fully appreciate the peak. I said that already. The peak or the valleys are where we find out whether we get it. But listen now to this. It's on the peak that we come to fully appreciate the valley, because the peaks are where we find out that we're to give that away. So think about this. On the one hand, there's something for us to get, but on the other hand, there's something for us to give. Remember on the Transfiguration, they talked about Jesus' death. That's what Luke tells us. So Jesus' peak was all about what he would do for others in the valley. And so too, our peaks are all about what we will do for others in the valley. On the peak we watch, but in the valley we live. Some of us are content to be voyeurs. We're content to watch what God does, or maybe even what other people do in the sense of what God does through them. But God wants us to be content with nothing less than being voyagers, who take those things from the peak down into the valley. Most people would be mountain dwellers if they could, but the people who need us most are in the valley. You can't help valley dwellers from the mountaintop. You can only help valley dwellers in the valley. And it's there in the valley that we bring something of the peak back with us. So dynamic range, man. It's all about highs and lows. The lows are all about the highs. The highs are all about the lows. They're not two different things. They're part of this dynamic range in our lives. Remember, we said that it's true. Life is like a roller coaster, but we don't have to go through it with white knuckles. Instead, we can be that crazy person on the roller coaster with their hands in the air, just like, woo, just loving it, knowing that God is at work, not only when we're on top, but even when we're at the bottom. Father, thank you for this story, and especially the opportunity to look at it right up against the other story. To see that the highs are part of life, but so too are the lows. They go hand in hand. The one preparing us for the other. Father, I pray that wherever people are at, the people watching this online service, whether they're at the top or whether they're at the bottom, may each and every one of us be reassured today that you're with us, that you're watching over us, that you care about us, that whether these are the best of times, the best experiences, or the worst, Lord, that it's all part of your greater plan to work not only in us, but to work through us in the lives of other people. Lord, thank you that, even though there's times that it's hard, and even though there's times that we don't understand, thank you that we can always fall back on the fact that the peaks, you give them. The valleys, you permit them. That you're in control, and we can trust you, and we don't have to be afraid. In Jesus' name, amen.
We hope you enjoyed this online service, and to learn more about Sola Church, you can go to solachurch.life.
For those of you that watch this service on Facebook, just wanted to let you know that Facebook is changing the way that we can display this, the way that we can share this. This is the last week that will air as a premiere, quote unquote. Beginning this next week, it can only be a scheduled post. So I'm not 100% sure what that's going to look like or be like on your end. I think what's going to happen is that 9:55 a.m. Pacific on our Facebook page, that service, which is usually uploaded on Friday, I think Sunday morning 9:55 a.m. Pacific, it's just going to go up as a post. So hopefully you won't have any trouble finding it. Keep in mind that you can always go to our website, solachurch.life, and there's a link from that page to the church online platform where we stream this service as well. So the other thing you can do, if you do watch on Facebook, we create an event for it every week, usually when we upload the service on Friday. So if you see that and you click going, then you are definitely going to get a notification. Also, if you've liked our Facebook page, you're likely to get a notification whenever we go live. So anyway, just want to keep you guys in the loop. Want to keep seeing you here at Sola Church Online for sure.
And we hope you have a wonderful week, and we will see you next week at Sola Church Online.
Bye, everybody.